In this session, I will discuss with you how we can study short-run economic fluctuations using the ADAS framework while drawing the or deriving the aggregate demand curve from the ISLM model. So we are going to derive the AD curve from ISLM model. So how do I go about it? Now we know that the aggregate demand curve is a relationship between price level and GDP, and we had said that the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping, and the intuition for the downward slope of the aggregate demand curve was because of three effects: the wealth effect, the interest rate effect, and the exchange rate effect. We had discussed the intuition for the slope of the aggregate demand curve, but we had not derived the aggregate demand curve. Now, the ISLM framework enables us to derive the aggregate demand curve. Let us see how. Now, as we know, aggregate demand curve is a relationship between GDP and the price level. Where does price level figure in my ISLM framework? It is in the LM curve, where I am saying money supply is equal to M bar by P bar. Okay, bar is for that the this number M is fixed and price level is fixed at P bar. Now, because price level is entering in the LSM in the ISLM model through the money supply, and we know when money supply increases or price level falls, the LM curve shifts to the right. Okay, now, and by the same token, when money supply falls or price level goes up, implies LM curve shifts to the left. Okay, the upward arrow is for rightward shift. This is my LM curve. So a upward shift is a rightward shift, upward arrow, and a downward arrow is a leftward shift. Okay, a leftward shift. This is my LM, LM1, this is LM2. Okay, now what is happening in my, let us consider the ISLM model and derive the aggregate demand curve. My IS curve was looking like this, and the LM curve initially, suppose it was drawn for M bar and price level was P1 bar. Okay, when price level was P1 bar, that means price level is P1, the GDP that I was getting was how much? Was Y1. Okay, because R is here and Y is here. Now, so this is one combination of GDP and price level. And if price level goes up while money supply remains same, this M by P will fall. So the LM curve will shift to the left. And how it would look like now? It would now look like a curve like this, and this LM curve is representing LM for M bar, and price level is now P2, and we are saying price level has gone up, so price level is P2, a higher price level has gone up. Now at the old IS curve, because IS curve nothing has happened to that, now what is my new equilibrium GDP? The equilibrium GDP is now Y2. This was Y1, this is Y2. So I am getting what? P2 and Y2 as another point. Okay, P1 Y1 was one consistent combination. Now P2 Y2 is another consistent combination, and what it is telling, it is getting us a downward sloping curve, a relationship between price level and GDP. And if you see, the aggregate demand curve that we have derived is the same downward sloping that we had discussed intuitively. Now we can talk about the implication of expansionary monetary and fiscal policy on the aggregate demand curve. I can show that. Let us try to show that. Suppose I will now use a fresh sheet. So now if you see, we want to see the impact of expansionary monetary and fiscal policy on the aggregate demand curve. I had drawn, this was my ISLM space, and this is the R and Y space, this is the P and Y space. So I am saying initially my IS curve was looking like initially it was looking like this. This was IS1, and suppose my LM curve was drawn for money supply of M1 and price level of P1. And in the previous diagram we had shown how the aggregate demand curve is derived from the ISLM model, and the aggregate demand curve was this, and suppose this was my price level was P1. Now price level remaining same, if money supply goes up, M1 becomes M2, what will happen? The LM curve will shift to the right, it will become LM1, and this corresponds to money supply, nominal money supply of M2, and price level remaining the same P1. So now P1 is corresponding to what? A level of GDP which is given as, suppose initially the income was at Y1. Ideally I should have plotted the P here, but it doesn't change our analysis. What we are saying, at the old price level now corresponds to a higher GDP, higher level of GDP. Okay, so that means my GDP initially was Y1, now is Y2 at the old price level, which is, suppose if I take another point, suppose money supply has fallen say to M2, so the new LM curve is LM2, and this is drawn for M3 by P1. Now what happens? The same price level is now corresponding to a much lower level of GDP when money supply is reduced. Okay, so if I am interested to know what will happen when money supply increases, I will get a aggregate demand curve which is a parallel shift of the old aggregate demand curve. So I am getting AD1. If money supply had fallen, the same price level now corresponds to a GDP level, lower level of GDP. Now this will be what? This will be a parallel shift of the aggregate demand curve, but now the aggregate demand curve is what? We can label it as AD2. So AD1 corresponds to when money supply goes up, AD2 corresponds to when money supply has gone down. We can now, so what we have seen, that when money supply goes up, what happens? The AD curve shifts to the right, an upward arrow is showing a rightward shift, and when money supply is falling, the aggregate demand curve is shifting down. Okay, when we had derived the AD curve from the ISLM model, we had assumed that money supply remains same and how price level when changes, how it impacts the GDP. But when we want to see what happens to the aggregate demand curve when money supply increases, we are keeping price level constant and we are seeing how the output changes at the old price level for a change in the money supply, either an increase or a decrease. We can also analyze the impact of fiscal policy on aggregate demand curve. Let us derive the aggregate demand curve first. So this was my IS curve, this was the LM curve, this is drawn for M1 by P1, and I am getting a GDP level. Suppose this is P1. So P1 Y1 was my initial combination, okay, P1 and Y1. Now suppose government spending increases, which will cause a rightward shift of the IS curve from IS0 to IS1. So that takes me to a higher level of output, equilibrium output, say Y2. So the same price level, suppose my aggregate demand curve was initially this AD1. I have taken only one price point so that the diagram is not cluttered. Now the same price level is now corresponding to a higher level of GDP. So what is happening? My IS curve is shifting from AD1 to AD2. Okay, the IS curve has shifted from AD1 to AD2. By the same token, suppose the government spending would have decreased. If government spending decreases and it becomes IS2, what happens to my new output level? It becomes, say, Y3. This was Y1, this was Y2, this is Y3. Now the same old price level is now corresponding to a aggregate demand curve, which is AD3. So when G increases implies AD shifts to the right and it becomes AD2. When G falls, there is a leftward shift of the aggregate demand curve, which we are showing through a downward arrow, and it becomes AD3. Okay, now having derived the aggregate demand curve from the ISLM model and also uh, seen the impact of monetary and fiscal policy on the aggregate demand curve, we are in a position to combine the aggregate demand and aggregate supply to study short-term economic fluctuation, and that we will be doing right now. So if initially the suppose the aggregate demand curve was like this, and suppose the generalized aggregate supply curve was like this, so at AD1. Now what was happening, my natural rate of output was this, and this was giving me what, this is Y here, this is P here, and generalized aggregate supply curve. So the economy, suppose this is say 7%. That means when the AD and AS are as depicted in the diagram, the growth rate that this economy is having is 7% and price level is P1, and this corresponds to say 5% inflation rate. Okay,